Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Eric. I think that probably everybody that watches this will know who I am, but just in case you don't, I am a molecular biologist slash microbiologist, and I work as a researcher. And a couple days ago, I made a video about COVID and how COVID infects you and spreads throughout your body and spreads to other people. And I also talked a little bit about the kind of difference between the different variants and also about how the vaccines work. So, when you're injected with a vaccine, what exactly is going on in your body and kind of what's in these vaccines. And I really wasn't expecting really anybody to watch it, especially because it was so long. It was like 50 minutes. But like a surprising number of people watched it, and at least some people seem to enjoy it. So I'm very happy about that. And in response to this last video, I had a request to cover or kind of talk a little bit about this one of the major kind of claims about the COVID vaccine that's causing a lot of people to be very hesitant, especially young women. And that claim is that the COVID vaccine can cause infertility. And of course, that's a very serious claim. And if that were true, it's understandable that people wouldn't want the vaccine. Like, a lot of us want to have kids. And so hadn't really heard too much about it until somebody had requested it, and did a little bit of digging into it, and it's actually a really interesting claim. There is kind of like a shred of like scientific basis for this claim, actually, but really just a shred. So it's almost like somebody that had taken like an intro to biology class started this claim, or I don't know, but I don't think that they really fully understand antibodies or how proteins work. So yeah, and I'll explain why that's my kind of perception of this claim. But yeah, so in this video, I'll just kind of explain the claim that's being made, and then I'll kind of explain the scientific, I guess, knowledge around the claim and whether or not it's actually true. And I can give you a little spoiler right now. It's very unlikely to be true. So yeah. I'll probably, again, skip through the drawing part, but I hope you guys enjoy this. And again, reach out to me if you guys have questions or other requests. I'm happy to go over them. I really like talking about this stuff. So yeah, just hit me up with any additional comments or questions. Okay, so I've gone ahead and drawn our COVID virus. To kind of begin explaining this, because of course the virus itself is important when we're talking about the COVID vaccine and claims about the COVID vaccine. So something I'll note really quick is if you haven't seen my first video, I really highly recommend that you go back and watch that, just because this video will make a lot more sense, because it's hard for me to kind of explain this claim without already knowing kind of the basics, and I'll try and make this a little more accessible, this video, if you really don't have the time to spare to watch the first video. Yeah, so if you can, go back and watch that video. If you can't, hopefully this makes sense. You can definitely reach out to me and I can try and explain it a bit better. But yeah, so I've gone ahead and drawn our COVID virus. And what we've got in our COVID virus is we have our viral genome, which is a single piece of RNA. And this RNA codes for more viruses. So as I talked about in the last video, viruses are kind of just parasites on life. And they're basically just stacks of genetic information that code for more viruses, or more stacks of genetic information. So they kind of take over cells and instruct the cell with this genetic information to produce more viruses. We also have our kind of membrane around the virus. So this is kind of the sac that the virus is held in, kind of protects it from the environment. And when you cough out a virus, this membrane is going to protect it from being degraded and allow it to infect the next person over, and also help you kind of enter your cell. And then finally, we have our spike proteins. So these spike proteins are just kind of sticking out of the virus, and they actually are going to be what binds to your cells and allows the virus to enter your cell. So as I talked about in my last video, so these spike proteins are the things that are going to bind to the ACE receptors on many of your cells, and by binding to this ACE receptor, the cell is going to kind of let it into the cell. And then, once the genetic information is inside of your cell, it's just going to start taking everything over and make more of itself. And of course, make you sick and steal resources from the cell. And it's not a good deal for the cell, basically. So also in my last video, I talked a little bit about the kind of vaccines and how they work. And basically, the kind of gist of the vaccine is that you're exposed to the spike protein. So these vaccines are either the actual spike protein itself that's being injected into you, or it's the genetic information for the spike protein, and then your cells will make it themselves. And by being exposed to this viral spike protein, your body is going to be like, oh my gosh, like, what is this? Let's destroy it and let's make some antibodies against it. So after you've been vaccinated, you are just teeming, like everywhere in your body, you're just teeming with antibodies that will target these spike proteins. So let's go ahead and draw out a couple antibodies. They kind of just look like these little Ys. So say that you've been vaccinated, you've got all of these antibodies, and a COVID virus just so happens to, enter your airway. You walk by somebody, last time I said the grocery store, let's change it up and say this time you're in a coffee shop and the person sitting next to you coughs or is talking or, breathing heavily for some reason. They really like their coffee. You happened to inhale a few COVID viruses from them, so but you've been vaccinated, so these antibodies are actually going to kind of latch onto these spike proteins. They're literally going to physically bind to them, and by binding to them, they're actually going to kind of handcuff the virus and keep it from binding to your cells. So go ahead and just draw that really quick. Okay, so we've got our antibodies that are kind of binding to the COVID virus. And because all of these spike proteins are now coated with antibodies, so you breathed in the virus and just, these antibodies just latched right onto it. Even if it, hits one of your cells, it's basically just gonna bounce off because it needs these spike proteins to actually bind to your cell and kind of gain entry into your cell. And so great. We have these antibodies and they're binding to the spike protein and basically neutralizing the virus, and we're protected. This claim about infertility does have to do with these antibodies and the fact that they bind to these spike proteins. So I'm just going to kind of expand on the fact that these antibodies are binding to the protein. So just kind of zoom in on this, we'll kind of spotlight it. And I'll go ahead and draw the membrane much larger. Let's give ourselves a little bit more space. Okay. Yeah. So this right here is the viral membrane. And kind of embedded in this membrane are the spike proteins. So I'll go ahead and draw that. So proteins are basically just these kind of squiggly bits. And they're composed of amino acids. So in my last video, I talked about the fact that proteins are kind of the product of our DNA. They're kind of, we have genes in our DNA and they're converted into proteins to actually carry out the function that is encoded in the DNA. So for the purpose of this, what we really need to know is that proteins are made up of amino acids that are kind of bound together in different sequences, and these different sequences will give the proteins different structures and different functions. Here I've kind of drawn out our spike protein, our COVID spike protein, and you can see that it's kind of just poking out of the membrane, and it's just got, I just gave it, this random structure. And I think this is typically actually what they look like. So popping out of the membrane, and then I'll also draw the antibody that's binding to it. It's the right color. Oops. And again, this is kind of a spotlight of what's going on right here. So just kind of spotlight that down. So you can see like, okay, we're kind of zooming in on this at like an atomic level. So we got our antibody that's binding to the COVID spike protein. Okay, great. This antibody is going to bind in a sequence-specific manner. So, as I just said, these proteins are made of amino acids in these different sequences, and that kind of gives them like different structures. And also these amino acids have different chemical properties, so they're going to bind to different things in different ways. So the reason that, the COVID spike protein is able to bind to your cells is because it has the perfect amino acids in the right places to be able to bind to receptors on your cell. And this is like very, very specific. Like it has to be pretty much the exact amino acids, and just changing one amino acid can make it so that they don't bind at all. The sequence of the protein is what allows it to bind to your cells, but it also allows it to bind to the antibodies that are being produced by the vaccine. Okay, so as I said, antibody is binding to the COVID spike protein. Whole point of the vaccine, it's going to keep the virus from binding to your cells and basically infecting you. Kind of the basis of this infertility claim was made by somebody who, they understood that, these antibodies, they bind to the COVID spike protein, they prevent the virus from entering your cell. Great. This person, whoever it was, they realized, wait a minute, humans also produce a spike protein. We produce a spike protein that is just naturally present in our genome. It's a gene that is present in all humans and actually primates. And this spike protein that's produced by humans, this human spike protein, is crucial for formation of the placenta. So I've gone ahead and drawn it out. So we have our human spike protein, and it's called syncytin 1. And I hope that that's how it's pronounced. I hope nobody will crucify me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, because I've looked all over to try and find how to pronounce this protein name. But anyways, so we've got our syncytin 1, and this protein is a spike protein that's produced, during pregnancy, and it helps the human cells form a placenta by kind of fusing different layers of cells. And not super important, but basically what you need to know is that the syncytin 1 is crucial for development of the placenta. So this claim is that we have antibodies that are produced by the vaccine because we were exposed to the spike protein that bind to the COVID spike protein. Their thought was, well, wait a minute, there's another spike protein that's being produced in human bodies too, and this spike protein is necessary for the placenta to form. And so this antibody, all of these antibodies that are produced by being vaccinated against the COVID spike protein would also bind to, this human spike protein. So we'll go ahead and just draw that out. Kind of this idea of what's going on according to this claim. Okay. So this idea is that because we kind of inoculated ourselves and caused ourselves to produce antibodies against the COVID spike protein, these antibodies are also going to bind to the spike protein that's necessary for placental development. And if this was true, if this happened, then yes, like it would be a problem. Absolutely. Like hands down, if we have antibodies in our body that are binding to a protein that is necessary for pregnancy, or it could be really anything. It could be a protein that allows you to see or hear, or I don't know, like speak, or anything. If there were antibodies that were binding that protein, then for sure that would disable the protein, and it would, in this case, make the woman infertile, very likely. And so that's kind of what I mean when I said that, this claim has a little like shred of, scientific basis. And it's definitely understandable that people would be like, oh yeah, like that makes sense that, you have antibodies against spike proteins, and there's another spike protein that we need to get pregnant, as a woman. And so, we don't want antibodies binding to that spike protein because then it's going to keep us from having children. But here's the problem. So, as I said, these proteins have kind of sequences that determine like basically what it can bind to. So these sequences are very specific, and they're kind of based on the amino acids present in the protein and kind of the order of these amino acids, and the order of the amino acids will determine whether or not it can bind to different things. So if you kind of actually look at the amino acid sequence of both of these proteins, it's like completely different. Like there's extremely low similarity between them, just as much similarity as, between this protein and, maybe some sort of membrane receptor in my eyes, or, something that like helps me smell, or, something that helps me hear. And so because there's very little similarity between these two proteins, basically no similarity between the proteins, I can tell you very, very confidently that these antibodies that are produced by the COVID vaccine against the COVID spike protein are not going to also bind to the spike protein that's produced in human cells. And I think that really the reason that this claim was started was just because somebody thought that, if antibodies bind to a spike protein, they're going to bind to all spike proteins. And just because we call something, like we as humans have given a protein a name, doesn't mean that they're, so similar that like molecularly antibodies are going to bind to it. And so, yeah, in this video, I'm gonna probably also do like a quick little screen grab or screen recording, and kind of show you guys that the sequences of these two proteins are completely different. And then I'll also show you a study that was done in Singapore that showed that COVID antibodies will not bind to the syncytin protein. They actually tested it. So yeah, I hope this is helpful, and again, like let me know if you guys have clarifying questions or something doesn't make sense. Okay, so hi guys. Kind of switching from whiteboard to computer. And if you're wondering why I'm wearing different clothes, it's because I am filming this on a different day. Just kind of broke it up a little bit. But I just finished talking about the fact that okay, when you're vaccinated, you produce antibodies against the COVID spike protein, right? And this claim about infertility is that these antibodies against the COVID spike protein that are produced by the vaccine, they are also going to bind to the placental spike protein syncytin 1. And, if that were to happen, then yeah, like that would be an issue. That would probably make people, women infertile. Um, and so, in response to that, I kind of explained, these proteins are not similar. And so the antibodies are like extremely unlikely to bind. And the only reason I say extremely unlikely instead of impossible is because I guess nothing is impossible, but very unlikely. And the reason that I came to that conclusion is kind of looking at the protein sequences, and I was just kind of hoping to do that with you guys and show you kind of the process, and also kind of share that study with you guys. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, so got some Google Chrome up. So, I talked about, the differences between these proteins are, I guess basically just the way proteins work is they're just chains of amino acids, and the sequence of these amino acids is what gives them different structures, different functions, and also determines, what they can bind to. And so, first step in comparing these two proteins, the syncytin 1 and the COVID spike protein, are to actually go find the sequences. So when I'm doing this kind of thing, this is actually something that, biologists have to do very, very often for other stuff, not for debunking conspiracy theories. All right, so I like to use this database called Uniprot. So they kind of go out and they collect, all of the information that they can on every protein that we've ever discovered, pretty much. So we can go ahead and look up SARS-CoV-2, aka COVID spike protein. All right. So we have our SARS-CoV-2 spike glycoprotein. So COVID spike protein. All right. So, this page is just full of protein information, just, all of the kind of data we've gathered on this protein. So I would guess that right now this protein is probably the most studied protein in the entire world. So there's a lot of information on it. Alrighty, so this is kind of a cool feature of this website. So they actually go through and they collect structure information. So they actually have computer generated images of the structures of these, different proteins, and, COVID spike protein being such a popular protein to study right now, there's a bunch of different structures for it. So let's go ahead and choose one of the full proteins. Alrighty, okay. So what you see here is the full COVID spike protein, and this is kind of what I was saying about proteins just being like these little squiggly bits. They're kind of funny looking, but basically what you're looking at is the full COVID spike protein, and then these kind of little, call them helixes, can think of them as like little spring shapes. So these are where kind of the membrane would be passing through. So this would actually be like inside of the membrane. And then this part up here, where it kind of expands like a bouquet of flowers, is actually the part that's sticking out of the virus. So this part up here is what actually is going to bind to your ACE2 receptors on your cells. And so there's amino acids, up on these, on the top of the protein that are going to actually bind to amino acids on your ACE2 receptor. So that's, that's how protein binding works basically. And yeah, so not really the focus of this video, but yeah, it's a cool little structure. So let's go ahead and find our sequence. All right, so here it is. So each of these letters here actually represents a different amino acid. And as you can see, it's kind of just a jumble. And this is, the sequence of the protein. So it's very long. It's over, it's almost 1,300 amino acids long. So we will go ahead and add that sequence to basket, just like we're spending too much money online, doing some Amazon shopping. Okay, and then we can also go ahead and pick up our syncytin 1 protein. Okay, so syncytin 1, organism, Homo sapiens, human. All right, so we can go ahead and go into here. Got all this information, not quite as much as the COVID spike protein, but still a good amount. Okay, so somebody, so this is a computer predicted structure of the protein. So that the COVID spike protein was actually like confirmed to be correct. So I'll just note that this is a computer generated image of the syncytin 1 kind of placental spike protein. But as you can see, just kind of based on this computer generated image, this is like, very, very different. It's a lot smaller. And kind of these domains up top are much, quite a bit different, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, can't really tell too much just by looking at it, but and what we really care about is like the sequence itself. But it's kind of just interesting to note that, these proteins don't even look the same. And I'll show you in a second, but the amino acids are not the same either. The sequence is not the same. So let's go ahead and find our sequence. So here it is. So this one's quite a bit smaller, as we could see in that photo. So it's about 540 or so amino acids. So we'll add that to our basket as well. It's on our grocery list. Oops. Nope. All right. Okay, so we've got our 2 proteins in our basket. So this allows me to just kind of export them all at once. And it'll pull this up in a different window, so you guys won't be able to see it, but just trust that it's the same sequences. This database isn't lying to me. All right. So we've got our 2 sequences, right? And it would be very difficult for me or you or anybody, any human, to go through and look at these 1,500, no more than that, like 1,800 letters, and be like, oh, these amino acids are the same, or these ones are the same. And so what we do as biologists, and also some computer scientists will also look into this and do this kind of thing if they dabble in biology. Take these sequences and we'll use a computer program. So this computer program is offered through the National Institutes of Health, kind of a little subdivision called the National Center for Biotechnology Information, or NCBI. And this computer program will just take 2 sequences, be that, RNA or DNA, which are both nucleotides is what they're called, or sequences of proteins, and compare them. These would be comparing nucleotides versus proteins and vice versa. So we'll go ahead and do the protein program. Okay, so go ahead and paste in our 2 protein sequences. All right. So this is our COVID spike protein, SARS-CoV-2. And I'll go ahead and grab our Homo sapiens syncytin 1 protein, or human placental spike protein. Oh, nope, sorry. I didn't hit copy. Let's clear that. Apparently. Still adjusting from Mac to PC, so I keep hitting the wrong letter sometimes. All right, so we've got our human syncytin 1 protein, and then we've got our COVID spike protein up there. So I think we're ready, so we can go ahead and hit blast. And this program will search for any similarity. So, not only does this program search for, are the letters the same, or like the actual exact amino acids the same, it'll also check and see if, say there's 2 amino acids that have very similar kind of chemical properties. it'll kind of consider those two amino acids to also be, somewhat similar. And so, if there was a stretch of amino acids where the exact amino acids weren't the same, but, they all had kind of the same chemical properties, it would also pick that up and be like, this stretch right here is kind of similar. But if we look here, so this program found no similarity. So what this means is that there's really no statistically significant level of similarity between these two proteins. So they're really not similar at all, is what that means. And if I really, really wanted to, I could go back and I could adjust the search and tell the program to be a little bit looser with its definition of similar, or a little bit more haphazard about it, and maybe find a couple of stretches where they're kind of similar but really not. But just kind of the default parameters that I used here are what'll tell us if there's any significant level of similarity. And so, basically what this means is that the COVID spike protein and our placental syncytin 1 protein are just as similar to one another as, either protein with like pretty much any other like membrane protein in the world. They're not similar. And really, I think that's why I've been saying is I think that this is just somebody who thought, oh, they're both called spike proteins. Like, just because they're called spike proteins doesn't mean that they're similar in terms of like chemical binding. So anyway, so the sequences, the amino acids in these proteins are not similar at all. And so therefore, the antibodies from the COVID vaccine that target the COVID spike protein should not bind to syncytin 1. They just shouldn't, because there's not the same amino acids for the antibody to bind to. But, there's still, just a teeny shred of doubt, maybe it's possible. And so the other thing I wanted to show you guys is this kind of study. So there's a lot of studies about this claim, and there's most of them I think have to do with showing that women who are vaccinated and women who were not vaccinated are having the same levels of miscarriages. And so there's no difference in fertility. There's also, I think, a safety study in mice. But this is kind of the one that really piqued my attention. And so this group in Singapore, so they wanted to address this study, or I'm sorry, this claim about infertility. And I guarantee that they went through the same thing that I just showed you guys. They kind of compared the proteins and they were like, they're not even similar. Like the antibodies are not going to bind. But I think just for the sake of, getting this over with and kind of a nail in the coffin on this claim, they actually went and they took antibodies from 15 women who were vaccinated with mRNA vaccines. They took their antibodies and they tested their antibodies for any ability to bind to the syncytin 1 protein. So the way that they did that is kind of using this technology that allows us to test the binding of proteins and antibodies, or proteins and proteins. It's called ELISA, ELISA, and it's really technical, so I won't get into it. But basically, it just tells us whether or not two things bind. So they went through, isolated the antibodies from all 15 women, checked for binding to syncytin 1, no binding. Cool. So that kind of solves our problem. But yeah, it's unfortunate that this has become a thing, but I think that it's good that we're just investing the resources like this to just show that this is just a myth. This is just unfounded claim about the vaccines, and it's really just a fear-mongering thing. but I'll kind of pull out a couple of key pieces of information from this for you guys. And you're welcome to read this, obviously. So here's the title, and then you can also pull the URL. And then it kind of takes you to this summary of the paper. But if you want to read the full thing, then you just click this download PDF. Okay. So kind of the major things. So they looked at female frontline workers who had never been infected with COVID and were vaccinated with the mRNA vaccines. So, of female frontline workers who had no history of COVID infection and were vaccinated with mRNA vaccines, they found 15 women who had received at least one dose of the mRNA vaccine. And of these 15 women, 5 of them were breastfeeding. And then 2 of the women were vaccinated during early pregnancy. So these were women that didn't know that they were pregnant, got the vaccine. Yeah, that shouldn't really matter whether or not they're pregnant, because we're going to produce the same antibodies pretty much, and you're just testing if it's going to bind to the placental protein. So they could pull antibodies from me if they really wanted to, but they chose 15 female participants. So they pulled their antibodies. Trying to find where that is. Yeah, okay, here we go. So they pulled the antibodies from these women's plasma. So that's basically just your blood with the blood cells removed. And so your plasma is just teeming with all of your antibodies, basically. So they took the plasma from these women, then tested it for any ability to bind to syncytin 1. And none of these women had plasma with antibodies that bound to syncytin 1, is what this is saying. And they tested it at different time after vaccination, just in case, there were some antibodies that took a while to produce or something like that. So yeah, that pretty much sums it up. If you did want to read through this on your own, it's really technical, but I'm happy to help. Just reach out to me, and I'm happy to walk through it with you. But yeah, I think at this point I'll probably cut back to the whiteboard and finish up. But yeah, I hope that this made sense. It got a little technical, but reach out to me if you have questions. Okay, so I just went through and kind of showed everybody that these proteins are not similar, despite the fact that they're both called spike proteins, and then also kind of showed you guys that research out of Singapore that was really unlikely that these antibodies are going to bind to the syncytin protein, but everybody's worried about it, so let's go ahead and just test it. And they did, and they didn't bind. So the idea of these two, the antibodies binding with this placental fusion protein, placental spike protein, are very unlikely, extremely unlikely to be true. And then finally, just before I kind of close out this video, I also wanted to kind of point something out to everybody. So, when you're vaccinated, you're going to produce these antibodies against the spike protein, but you're also going to produce these antibodies against the spike protein if you're actually infected with the COVID virus. So with the Delta variant, I talked about this in my last video, but with the Delta variant being so contagious, and with the virus continuing to evolve to be even more contagious because people are not getting vaccinated, it's very likely that you will, if you are not vaccinated, that you will catch COVID. And so if that were to happen, not only do you need to worry about the antibodies binding to placental spike proteins, which very, very, very extremely unlikely to happen, you're going to have to worry about the symptoms that come with actually being infected with COVID. The risk of actually dying from the acute infection and all of the damage that happens to your body during a COVID infection. So things like brain damage, lung damage, cardiovascular damage. And so I would make the argument that, perhaps it's a lot less risky to kind of take your chances with just being exposed to the spike protein and kind of getting antibodies against the spike protein than, you know, risking actually catching COVID and, you know, having these spike protein antibodies anyways on top of everything else that's going to happen when you're infected. So it's unfortunate that this claim has become such a big thing, and you know, I've mentioned this, but it definitely makes sense that people are hesitant after they hear this claim, because it does make sense. You know, antibodies against spike proteins might bind another spike protein that's necessary for placental development. But you know, as I've kind of shown here, that's extremely unlikely to be true, and I really encourage everybody to kind of take this information and weigh the risks and benefits on whether or not they would like a vaccine. So yeah, again, reach out to me if you guys have further questions or comments, or if you want me to cover some other myth, I'm happy to do it. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope that this was insightful. Thank you.